Hi and welcome. Brad Black, known as Brad the Bike Boy, is one of Australia's foremost Ducati tuners. Brad has written extensively about tuning Ducatis and other marques and has published many articles on his website. I was lucky enough to catch up with Brad at his workshop last Saturday for a chat. I hope you enjoy it. Well, welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Mike.
So how did you get started as a mechanic?
Well, when I was at school, I always wanted to be a mechanic. I had bikes at home, like an old Yamaha 100 dirt bike that I pulled apart and probably did more bad than good to. But everyone said I was too good at school to be a mechanic, so I went and did mechanical engineering at RMIT. And when I finished that, I went to work in a car workshop in St Kilda. I was meant to be installing an engine dyno, doing engine development work. That never really happened. Became a mechanic there. At a place, the guy who owned it had a lot of experience. He was ex-Repco Brabham, ex-Ford, GTHO. So I learnt a lot there, and good place to work, good place to leave ultimately.
How long did you stay there?
2.5 years.
So not long, really.
Not long, no.
And where'd you go from there?
Well, Rob, who had worked there with me, he had a 907, and he went to Moto 1, or Moto Italiano, which had just moved to the Oakley shop. That was 94, to get it serviced one day, and they said, oh, we need a mechanic, and so he started working there, and a month later the other mechanic there left. So he rang me and said, do you want to work on bikes? And I sort of went, I don't know. And I'd always had bikes as a kid and played with them and pulled them apart, and I managed to mostly rebuild a KDX 175 when I was 14 or 15. And then Trev, who was one of the bosses there at that point in time, rang me, I think, the next day and said, well, we actually got a training course for some new models coming up in a week and a half's time. It'd be great if you could be there. So I gave notice where I was and went to Moto Italiano.
So that's where the love affair with Ducati started.
It did. We had a 3-day training course, and Scott Walker, who was at NFI, I think it was Fraser's service manager, and sort of that point of time NFI weren't possibly as big as they were now. He came in a training course. So the first day we serviced a 900 Monster, which is a pretty new model then. This is July 94. And the second day we serviced a 888, did a first service on a 888. I remember we were pulling it apart, and some guys knew what they were doing with them. I didn't, had no idea. First time I'd ever seen them. And we pulled the airbox of the 888, and there was a throttle body, and we opened it up and looked down, and you could just see straight down to the 2 valves. I just fell in love. And that was, I don't know if you can see by the 851s. That is the model that I just absolutely love, is the 851. More than the 888, the early 851s are just my thing. So that was the start of it, and we're also Moto Guzzi dealers. So lots of Guzzi's. I think the first bike I actually serviced was a T3. And when I serviced it, Rob said go for a ride, and I was a fairly inexperienced rider. Had my licence, hadn't really ridden much. I went out for a ride, and I got back, and I said to Rob, can you please go for a ride in that? Because there's got to be something wrong with it. And he said, no, that's it. And that was it. But, and yeah, I really came to love the Guzzis and the Ducatis. And back in those days, did a lot of bevel drives, a lot of older Guzzis, occasional Laverda and Marini or something, but most of it was, lots of Monsters and Super Sports from the 90s, that sort of thing. And
so what did you sort of specialise on in the end? Because I noticed that you were more interested in engine rebuilding and performance, certainly towards the end of your stay there.
We didn't do a whole lot of engine rebuilds. I think people sort of assumed we would be doing engines all the time, but it didn't happen that much. And primarily because of the cost. And even these days, someone will come in and say, I need a rebuild on I did an ST4S engine a couple of years ago. And it appeared 2 years before I actually rebuilt it. The guy brought it in and said, it's got a bit of a noise, was due for a service, and it had the failed big ends. I said to him, well, the bike had 80 odd thousand Ks on it. I said, the engine rebuild's going to cost what the bike's worth. And so he went away, took it away. And then he appeared a couple of years later with the engine and said, rebuild it.
It's a bit like old Ferraris back in the 80s, where they were not worth the cost of rebuilding, whereas they are, of course, today.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like $8,000 engine rebuild on an $8,000 bike just doesn't make any sense.
No.
So we didn't do much engine rebuilding, but I guess saying that, I did a couple of couple of Gutsi engines at the time in the first couple of years. I bought an Eldorado we were restoring for someone. He wanted to pull out halfway through, and I'd done most. I did the engine. I'd done the gearbox as well. Did a few other engines. We did had a 916 SP engine that ran the big ends, I think, on someone's dyno that I rebuilt. And it was the first time. That was the first time I really got into it. I think I got a lot of advice on that engine from Pete Smith, who was Epicycle in Sydney. He ran the dealer team for the first few years before they sort of took it in-house.
Well, I guess if you weren't doing engine rebuilds, perhaps it was more at doing performance modifications to customers' bikes.
Even that, not so much.
I'm just thinking from your various write-ups on
most of the write-up stuff, all the internet stuff was when I broke my leg in 2000. So that was sort of preceding that. I think I first started looking on the internet probably early 2000. If I hadn't been exposed to the internet before. Hang on, when was that? Yeah, it would have been early 2000. I found a site in America called Doug Lofgren's site. And Doug I've got to know fairly well over the internet. Never actually met Doug physically, but... and Doug's website model was what I modelled ours on. It's pretty much an exact copy. And Doug's really good with writing and laying it out. And when I first started with the website, it was more a approach from a business promotion tool. Like, this is what we can do for you. But I guess as you know, it sort of morphed fairly quickly into me just rambling about what we did and what worked and what didn't work. And I sort of found that people enjoyed what didn't work as much as what did. And some people would say it's all over my head anyway. Like, I don't understand what you're talking about. I just like reading it and that sort of stuff. So the website became just
popular in its own right, I suppose. Yeah.
And just something I did because I like sharing the knowledge. It's knowledge. It's all information. I mean, now I work on my own, but at some point in time, I really need to employ someone to try and get all the information that's in here to other people and the websites.
Now, I guess you haven't really had much time for the website over the last few years, have you?
Mainly, well, time is the first thing. And I used to go home and write it at night, whereas I go home and I want to go to bed at 10 o'clock, or my eyes are getting old and they don't see so well past 9 o'clock. But primarily it's because of the work I do. Most of my work here for the last 7 years has been service work. And ultimately, in a one-man business, service work is where the money is.
Yeah.
In, out, in, out, in, out.
So you haven't had as many projects that were worth writing about?
That's primarily it. And the fact that at Moto 1 we'd have demo bikes. So I'd say to Tony, I want to grab this bike, dyno it, we'll put an exhaust on it, we'll do the cam timing, dyno it again, and that became a report. And so most of the Moto 1 days website stuff was demo bikes.
So we'll just step back a little bit. So when did you leave Moto 1? It started off obviously as Moto Italiano, then changed its name when it got the BMW distributorship. But
97.
97, that far back?
No, so 97 was when we got BMWs. Moto 1 went under in October 2008. And then I bought all the workshop equipment and opened got this factory, filled it up, and started working February 2009 as Brad the Bike Boy. So this is my 8th year.
Well, it does seem longer,
Yeah, it's odd. Some things seem to be so long ago and some things not. It's funny, I've got a good memory for bikes and often for customers in as much as their bike, what's been done to their bike. And people say, oh, you remember when you did this to my bike? I look it up on the computer and say, oh, that was 7 years ago. And I think, wow, 7 years ago. But even at Moto 1, I was there 14 and a half years. And at Moto 1, first it was Ducati, Guzzi, and then we lost Guzzi, I think, in 96. And then but at the same time, we had Bimotors. So had SB6 Bimotors, and the odd had a Mantra as well, a few Bimotors. And then when that didn't work, they took BMW on in 97. And that was a whole new thing with BMW, lots of training and stuff. So technically there was a lot of stuff to learn then. And then 2006, we took Aprilia and Guzzi on, again through samples, and that was a whole new thing. So at Taliano Moto 1, it was sort of, I guess, steps along the way. There were changes along the way that kept it sort of interesting.
So where do you see yourself and the business going into the future?
I think I'll become much like Bob Brown did. I'll have my era, and as the bikes slowly peter off, I'll slowly peter off. And by the time they're almost done with, I'll be retired.
Unless there's a resurgence in interest in the models you specialise in.
Yeah, I mean, most of the bikes I see these days are probably from 2000 to 2010. When I started at Moto Italiano in '95, it was 75 to 95 sort of thing, that range. And the Panthers, we used to see a lot of Panthers and bevel drives and that sort of stuff, and you just don't ever see that stuff anymore. And really, you often don't want to. The last couple of Panthers I've had in Europe have been nightmares. For the owners, in as much you start working on it and it just skyrockets, and you say to them, look, where do you want to stop? So I imagine it as the bikes keep coming. Like, I haven't really done much Panigale work as yet, and it's a bit of a shift in as much as it's the first new Ducati for a long time. Like everything else, even a 1200 Multistrada or something, it's just a glorified Panta.
Yeah.
And so it works. I mean, I had to pull it apart, but apart from that, the engine itself is just an evolution of Pantas from 1979. So that's all. Anything with a Panta-based engine is easy to work on, and the electronic side of it is just a new angle. The electronic side of it, you just have the right tools to service it, and it's kind of knowledge-based stuff. It's not really a new thing, it's just a continuation of the electronic theme.
Yeah.
So I expect that I will just keep working on the bikes, but the older bikes will be where, like Ducati City won't work on most of the stuff we're sitting around. They probably wouldn't work on. They might probably work on the Paul Smart, but they certainly wouldn't work on the Carby Supersport.
No, I guess they sort of draw a line in the sand of how far back they're going to support model-wise.
And people will have a go at a dealership for that, but that's a decision you have to make as a dealership.
Well, you can't carry all the special tools, the expertise, because for older models, because it's not required very often. It's not economically viable.
That's right. I asked Neil about Carby parts, Neil at Ducati, or Fraser's Melbourne, I think they call it now, about parts for carburetor bikes. And he says, I'm the only one who buys them almost. So that's the sort of thing as it comes. So as the dealerships move forward in what they work on, people will need to find other people to work on the older ones. And I'm really surprised there aren't more Ducati specialists, although there are a lot of people who work on them who don't sort of specialise as such. I'm the only one who I think really specialises, as in I won't work on anything else. Most guys will work across a range of things. So I imagine that as I get older, I'll work on the older bikes, and that'll just see me through to the end.
Well,
realistically,
I hope so. Well, I'd just like to thank you for your time today, Brad.
It's a pleasure, Mike.